So today we're going to be looking at what's called your thorax, which you guys know of as your chest region, as well as spinal alignment. Now, in the case of your skeleton, remember you have 206 bones, and we've talked about all the bones of the skull and the face and your jawbone, as well as your hyoid bone. And we're going to continue on looking at the axial skeleton. Remember, the axial skeleton is your skull, your rib cage, and your vertebra. And this page goes along, or this PowerPoint goes along with page 28 in my coloring book. Remember, my coloring book is the one that has the skulls on it. So if you have a different coloring book, then you'll need to flip through and find the one that talks about the rib cage. And it's in my book, it's labeled Skeletal and Articular System, the Bony Thorax. Now, we talked about how you have 206 bones in your body. 24 of them are your ribs alone. You have 12 pairs of ribs. And remember, the real name for your ribs, as you can see, are what we call your costa. Now, we're also going to talk about your sternum, which is what you call your breastbone. And your costa, your rib cage, articulate on the backside. Remember, articulate means to form a joint. It articulates on the backside with what we call your thoracic vertebra, as you can see in this PowerPoint, and you can see on page 28 in your coloring book. And we're going to talk about the 5 different groupings of your vertebra here momentarily. But in the case of your costa, in your book, you'll see 12 ribs. You'll see what we call 7 true ribs, 5 false ribs, and 2 of them are floating ribs. And you can see true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs on this PowerPoint as well. But you'll also see other terms that go along with those, and I'll explain the shift in how we talk about your ribs. But the first thing we're going to look at is your sternum, which is commonly called your breastbone. And remember, your sternum is an example of a flat bone. Remember, flat bones get their name because, well, they're flat. Okay? And even though they can be long, they don't have an epiphysis and a diphysis and a growth plate. So therefore, they cannot be called long bones. They are flat bones. And remember, flat bones tend to curve. And when you think about your breastbone, you think of it as being pretty flat, pretty straight. But the bottom part, the part that's called the xiphoid process, actually curves down. And that's why people have to be real careful when performing CPR, as we're going to talk about in a second. But in the case of your sternum is actually 3 bones that have fused together over time. And you will see what's called the manubrium. You'll see what's called the body, and you'll see what's called the xiphoid process. This is also listed in your coloring book. Now, in the case of the manubrium, this is the top portion. Okay? The body has a name, and I want you to change that name, please. Okay? The body is also called the gladiolus. Okay? Gladiolus. Okay? Gladiolus. Gladiolus. And then you have the xiphoid process at the end. Now, the manubrium is what the term is referred to as the handle. The term gladiolus means knife or blade. That's where gladiators get their name from. And then the xiphoid process, xiphoid means to point, and that's at the end. Now remember, ancient people were very, very, very resourceful. And this bone's parts get their name from the fact that ancient peoples would use this part of the skeleton as a knife or a blade. If you leave the cartilage connected to the manubrium, you could actually tie a rope around it with another stick, and you'd have yourself a spear. Okay? Or you could actually hold it that way and use it as a knife. But the manubrium is the handle, it's the top portion. Now the body is also called the gladiolus, and like I mentioned, that term means knife or blade. And then the point down at the bottom is the xiphoid process. And you can very easily see how these 3 bones have sutured together in order to form one larger bone. Okay. Now, when you're performing, for those of you who know CPR, you're supposed to take your finger and find the tip of your sternum and then go up 2 or 3 fingers before you actually place your hand on the chest and begin chest compressions. The reason for that is the fact that this is a flat bone. It does curve. And the xiphoid process is sutured onto the manubrium. So if you start performing CPR in the wrong place, you can actually break the xiphoid process off. And since it is a sharp point, when you're doing chest compressions, you could actually be stabbing that person's heart and lungs with that bone shard. But this is the sternum. And the ribs, most of your ribs, articulate with the sternum on the front. Okay? Now, all ribs, which we call costa, articulate with the thoracic vertebra in the back. And you can see this very easily on page 28. You have 12 pairs of thoracic vertebra. You have 12 pairs of ribs. And the nice thing is your ribs aren't named. So we talked about 206 bones of your body. Here's 24 of them right now. Okay. They do not have individual names. However, they are divided up into 3 different groups. Now, your coloring book talks about true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs. However, we're trying to get away from those names because when people see false ribs, it makes you think they're not ribs, and they are. So this is why we have the new names vertebrosternal ribs, vertebrochondral ribs, and floating ribs. Now, all ribs articulate on the backside to your thoracic vertebra. And so you can see on page 28 how the ribs articulate. Remember, articulate means forms a joint or rest up against the vertebra of your back. And you can see how your ribs are also classified as flat ribs because they do curve around. Now, in the case of your ribs, like I said, when you see true ribs versus false ribs, it makes you think the false ribs are not real ribs. So we're getting away from that common terminology and going towards the more medical scientific terminology. Now, if you'll notice in the case of your ribs, they all start with a vertebra. You have vertebrosternal, vertebrochondral, and then just vertebral ribs. This is due to the fact that all ribs articulate with your vertebra. So by having vertebra in all these names, it lets you know that your ribs, your costa, are attached to the vertebra in the back. All of your ribs are attached. Okay? And so again, with floating ribs, it makes you think they're just kind of floating there. Okay? False ribs make you think that they're not really ribs. Okay? But in the case of your ribs, all 12 pairs of your ribs articulate with your thoracic vertebra, which are the vertebrae that make up your chest region. So this is why vertebra is in the names of all these types of ribs. Now, in the case of your floating ribs, which are ribs 11 and 12, I'm going to start with those first. Okay. Floating ribs get their name because they do not come all the way around to the front. That's why there's not a second part to the name. Like you see vertebrosternal, you have two parts, vertebra and sternum. Or vertebrochondral, you have two parts, vertebro and chondral. Okay. But then you just have vertebral ribs. Okay. The name vertebral ribs lets you know they do attach to the vertebra, but they don't attach to anything in the front. Okay. So therefore, they are floating. Okay. These are the smallest pairs of ribs that you have. Ribs 11 and 12 do not wrap all the way around to the front, and they actually help protect your kidneys and the organs of your lower back. Okay. Most people don't realize how far down your rib cage comes. You can take your fingers and follow your ribs down, and you find that they pretty much, the bottom part of your ribs that you can feel, line up with your belly button. Okay. Well, your floating ribs do not wrap around to the front, okay? And these are what we call ribs 11 and 12. These are the shortest ribs that you have. So they only articulate on the backside with your vertebra. That's why they're called vertebral ribs. Now, the other two articulate or attach in the front and the back. That's why there's two parts to their name. Okay. Now, ribs 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, and 7. So the first 7 pairs of your ribs, which were commonly called your true ribs, are now called your vertebrosternal ribs. Okay. Now, vertebra lets you know that they articulate with the vertebra in the back. Sternum lets you know that they wrap around and directly line up with the sternum in the front. Now, you can see in your picture ribs 1 through 7, and you can see in this PowerPoint, if I had a string, and I took a string from the back for ribs 1, 2, all the way down through rib 7, if I took the string and wrapped it around your body, that string would cross over your sternum. So that's what the sternal part of the name means. Okay? With vertebrosternal, they articulate, they attach to the vertebra in the back, and they directly line up with the sternum in the front. Now, ribs 8, 9, and 10 also attach to your sternum. However, notice they're called vertebrochondral ribs. Chondro means cartilage. So vertebra lets you know that they articulate with the vertebra in the back, but they line up with cartilage in the front. As you can see from this picture, ribs 8, 9, and 10, if I took a string and wrapped it around your body, that string would not cross over your sternum. So ribs 1 through 7 are called vertebrosternal ribs. They articulate with the thoracic vertebra in the back, and they directly line up with the sternum in the front. Ribs 8, 9, and 10 do attach to the sternum. However, they do not line up with the sternum. That's why they're called vertebrochondral ribs. Vertebral lets you know they articulate with the thoracic vertebra in the back, but they directly line up with cartilage on the other side. Then your floating ribs, ribs 11 and 12, are simply called vertebral ribs. They do not attach to the sternum. They do not wrap all the way around. So they only attach to the vertebra, which is why that's the only part of their name. So as you can see on page 28, it does talk about the 3 parts of the sternum. It also talks about your 12 ribs, your true ribs, your false ribs, and your floating ribs. You have 12 pairs of true ribs. You now will be calling them your vertebrosternal ribs. You have 3 pairs of false ribs. You will now be calling them the vertebrocondylar ribs. And then you have 2 pairs of floating ribs, which you will now be calling your vertebral ribs. Now, in the case of your rib, again, your rib is a flat bone. And you can see on page 28 the overall shape of your rib. Okay. It does look a lot like a long bone. However, it doesn't have an epiphysis, it doesn't have a diphysis, it doesn't have a growth plate. Okay. It does have facets. Okay. And facets we talked about. These are areas where things come together to form a joint, so it is going to be covered in articular cartilage. A facet is also an example of a fossa, and a facet is also an example of a condyle. But no matter which rib you're talking about, ribs just pretty much vary in their length. They all have the same general overall structures to them, as you can see on page 28. What we're going to look at now is what's called vertebral alignment. And this is going to go along with what's in my coloring book, page 25. And in the case of your vertebral column is what you commonly call your spine. And the reason that your spine is called your spine is because of the projections it has on the back. If you remember, we talked about a spine as any sharp process that sticks off a bone in order to protect you. And so you have these spines, these projections, these sharp points that branch off the back of the vertebra that run down your back. And that's where your spine gets its common name. But you know that the real name is called your vertebra. And again, page 25 is labeled, or in my book, is labeled your vertebral column. If you have a different coloring book, please find this page. But in the case of your vertebra is a series of bones. You have your what we call your cervical vertebra, your thoracic vertebra, your lumbar vertebra, your sacrum, and your coccyx bone. And remember, anytime 2 bones come together, that forms a joint. And anytime you have bones that move, you need cartilage there in order to keep those bones from grinding together. So your vertebrae are separated by what we call your intervertebral disc. And in the case of your intervertebral disc, inter meaning between, what are they between? They're between your vertebrae. And your intervertebral disc are basically really, really, really strong sacs of cartilage. Now, if you remember, we talked about 3 kinds of cartilage. We talked about hyaline cartilage, which is the cartilage that your skeleton was made of when you were born. It's still in your nose, it's in your thorax. Hyaline cartilage is what makes up the cartilage of your ribs. So we talked about so you could breathe. We also had elastic cartilage, which is a little bit more flexible, and we found that in our ears. And if you remember, the 3rd type of cartilage was fibrocartilage. And fibrocartilage got its name because it's made from really thick woven fibers together. And most of the time it's collagen fibers, which we've been talking about. Well, if you'll notice on page 25, it talks about your intervertebral disc, and you'll see what's called the annulus fibrosus, and you'll see what's called the nucleus pulposus. In the case of your intervertebral disc, think of them as really, really, really thick water balloons, but instead of having water on the inside, it kind of has a goo. Now, the actual cartilage is fibrocartilage, and the woven sac of fibrocartilage is what's called the annulus fibrosus. Annulus lets you know that it is a circle, it's a square, it's a sac. Fibrosus lets you know it's made from woven fibers. So the annulus fibrosus is actually the fibrocartilage that makes up what we call our spinal disc or intervertebral disc. The goo that's on the inside is called the nucleus pulposus. Nucleus lets you know it's in the middle, and pulposus lets you know it's like a pulp. It's like a goo. Okay. Think of your intervertebral disc again, or as really, really, really thick, strong jelly donuts. And that's there because as you go down your body gets heavier because it's got more bones stacked on top of each other. And these bones will press on each other. We constantly move our vertebrae. So we need this thick cushion. It's just like the gel pads that people put inside their shoes. So they're there to cushion, they're there to help bear your weight. And these are what we call your intervertebral disc. When people get like herniated disc, these pieces of cartilage have torn away from the bone and they've started to slide around and they can pop and the goo comes out, which can lead to the bones grinding together. If they slide backwards, they can press up on a nerve and that causes a pinched nerve. And that's what things like herniated disc or what people call slip disc are. Now, when we look at your spine does have what we call a normal curvature. And you have this picture on page 25. And in the case of our normal curvature, we have your shoulders should be directly lined up with your hips. Now, remember, nobody is perfect. So nobody has perfect curvature, which we're going to talk about in a second. But in the case of your vertebra, you can see that each vertebra is given a name according to its location. Now, we talked about you have 206 bones of your body. We did the bones of the skull. We just talked about your 12 pairs of ribs. So that's 24 bones right there. We did your sternum. So that's 25 of the 206 bones. And now we're going to look at even more. But the nice thing is, again, with your vertebra, they don't have individual names, except for 2 of them. All of your vertebrae are divided into sections. And you have those regions listed in your coloring book. You'll see your cervical vertebra, your thoracic vertebra, your lumbar vertebra, your sacral vertebra, and what's called your cosyngeal vertebra. Now, in the case of your cervical vertebra, these are the vertebrae of your neck. And these are simply named C1 through C7. You have 7 cervical vertebrae. Now, cervical vertebra number 1 and cervical vertebra number 2 are the only vertebrae in your body that have a name. And as you can see on my PowerPoint here, I'm not sure if it mentions it on that page. It does talk about it on page 26 and page 27, and we're going to do the vertebra in more detail later. But vertebra number 1 is called the atlas. Now this has a very unique shape. It doesn't look like the other vertebrae in your body. But if you think back to mythology, Atlas was the guy who held the world on his shoulders. And so this is the vertebra that's holding your skull. Now, the one right underneath that, cervical vertebra number 2, is called the axis. And the term axis means to move or pivot, because this is the vertebra that moves in order to allow you to move your head around. You have 7 cervical vertebrae. They're simply numbered C1 through C7. However, C1 is also called the atlas, and C2 is also called the axis. And these are the vertebrae of your neck. The vertebrae of your chest, like I mentioned before, are called your thoracic vertebra. You have 12 pairs of these, and they're simply numbered T1 through T12. They do not have individual names. Your lower back is your lumbar vertebra, and they're simply named L1 through L5. These are the largest, thickest vertebrae you have that are individual. By the time we get to the bottom, our vertebrae have fused together. That's because we are bipedal, we stand up, and we need these bones strong in order to allow us to bear the weight and walk on 2 legs. So cervical vertebra, thoracic vertebra, and lumbar vertebra are all individual bones. C1 through C7, T1 through T12, L1 through L5. By the time we get to the sacrum, your sacrum are actually 5 vertebrae that have fused together, and this is commonly called your butt bone. In the case of your coccyx bone is actually not needed in humans. The coccyx bone are 3 or 4, it really depends on the person, small vertebrae that have fused together. This is commonly called the tailbone. Now, as a fetus, we had a tail, we wagged it, but that tail was incorporated into our bodies, and we have no need, in all honesty, for our coccyx bone anymore. And you can see here, again, 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 1 sacrum, and 1 coccyx bone. Take you back here to picture B. In the case of kyphosis and lordosis, we're going to be looking at picture A. This is where something is wrong with your shoulder or your hip curvature. And the first one you have there is what's called kyphosis. Okay. Kyphosis is commonly called hunchback. Now remember, in the case of your spine, your shoulders should directly line up with your hips. In people with kyphosis, their shoulders are thrust forward, and so that gives them a little hump on the back, as you can see in this picture here. Okay. So the picture on the left is kyphosis. You can see how their neck is kind of shoved forward because they have this abnormal curvature in their spine. And this is what's commonly called hunchback. Now the opposite of that, which is what the second picture is dealing with, is called lordosis. Okay. Lordosis is commonly called swayback, which is what I have. And so unfortunately I'm not here to show you, but remind me and I will show you the next time that I see you. But lordosis is when the lower back the curvature is overpronounced and your hips are shoved forward. So in the perfect world, your shoulders and hips are aligned. With kyphosis, the shoulders are thrust forward, and with lordosis, the hips are thrust forward.